October 12, 1887. The air held the sharp, clean edge of coming frost. Agnes finished folding the last of her late husband's wool shirts, placing it inside the worn canvas sack that now contained everything she was permitted to own. The inventory was brutally short: 2 dresses, the shirts, a tarnished silver locket with no chain, a small Bible with a cracked leather cover, and her husband Thomas's walking stick, its ashwood worn smooth by a lifetime of use. Now it was hers. At 70 years of age, her own hands, knotted with arthritis, found its familiar weight a grim necessity rather than a comfort. Her golden retriever, Rufus, lay by the door, his head on his paws, watching the man in the center of the room with an unbroken, silent tension. The man was Martin, her husband's nephew, a man whose face seemed perpetually frozen in an expression of mild disappointment with the world. He held a sheaf of papers, the legal instruments that had turned her home of 40 years into his property. He had found a flaw in the old will, a forgotten county ordinance about witness signatures, and a circuit judge in a distant town had agreed with his lawyer. The farm was his now. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound in the funereal quiet of the packed-up room. "The wagon is waiting, Agnes. It will take you as far as town. From there, your arrangements are your own." His tone was not cruel, it was something far worse, impersonal, as if he were discussing the relocation of livestock. Agnes looked not at him, but at the floorboards she had scrubbed on her hands and knees for 4 decades. "There are no arrangements," she said. Her voice was steady, a low and even thing that offered no purchase for pity. "I have 23 cents." Martin gave a small, impatient sigh. "That is not my concern. The law is the law." Thomas should have been more careful with his affairs. He gestured toward the door. Rufus emitted a low growl, a rumble that vibrated through the floor. "Call off your doggy." Agnes placed a hand on the dog's head, and the growling ceased. She picked up the canvas sack, the effort making her shoulder ache, and then her walking stick. She did not look at Martin again as she walked out of the house, each tap of the stick on the porch a final, percussive farewell. The town wagon was there, its driver looking at his boots, a study in determined neutrality. A few neighbors watched from their own properties, their faces a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. No one stepped forward. In this place, the law was a cold and distant god, and Martin had its scripture on his side. She climbed onto the hard wooden bench, Rufus leaping up beside her, and did not look back as the wagon jolted into motion, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. The line shack was a relic, a small, square box of sun-bleached planks left over from the days when the big ranches ran cattle this far north. Its door hung from one leather hinge and the roof was a sieve of missing shingles, but it was a structure. For 3 days, it was home. Agnes used stones to build a small fire ring outside, conserving the few matches she had. The 23 cents were still tied in a handkerchief in her pocket, a useless talisman against the encroaching cold. The nights were the worst. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees, then 35. The wind found every crack in the shack's walls. She and Rufus huddled together under her one thin blanket, the dog's warmth a small, living furnace against her back. By day, she gathered fallen branches, her movement slow and deliberate, each stoop and rise a negotiation with her aching joints. The walking stick was her third leg, sinking into the soft earth as she navigated the uneven ground. She ate nothing, saving the half-loaf of bread she'd been given by the wagon driver. She drank from a nearby creek, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. On the 4th day, a woman from a neighboring homestead rode by, saw the smoke, and stopped. She offered a small bag of cornmeal and a thick slice of bacon. "It's a hard thing," the woman said, avoiding Agnes's eyes. Martin, he's always been, particulars. The charity was welcome, but the pity was a stone in her throat. Agnes simply nodded. "The Lord provides," she said, the words tasting like dust. The woman rode off, duty done, leaving Agnes in the immense silence of the high plains. That night, she cooked a small portion of the cornmeal over the fire, sharing the meager meal with Rufus. The sky was a vast, star-dusted sheet of black ice. An owl called from the cottonwoods by the creek. The sound was lonely, but it was also a reminder that she was not the only creature trying to survive the night. She understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that she was utterly alone. The town was 5 miles away. A room for the winter, even in the meanest boarding house, would cost dollars she did not have. The church might offer a cot for a week, but then what? She was 70 years old. She was not built for labor. Her only assets were a loyal dog, a walking stick, and a will that had not yet broken. It was, she concluded, not much of a bulwark against the coming winter. On the 7th day, as a skein of geese flew south in a ragged V, a man appeared. He didn't ride up on a horse, he simply materialized from the landscape, a tall, gaunt figure in buckskins, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and sun damage. He moved with a quiet economy that spoke of a life lived outdoors, and he held an old, long-barreled rifle in the crook of his arm. Rufus stood and barked once, a sharp, interrogative sound, before Agnes quieted him with a word. The man stopped 20 feet from her small fire. He was old, perhaps even older than she was, but his eyes were a sharp, startling blue. "You're Thomas's wife," he said. It was not a question. Agnes nodded, her hand resting on her walking stick. "I am." "He's gone now, I heard," the man said. "I'm Saul. Your husband pulled me out of a blizzard back in '79. Up on the Greeley Pass. My leg was broke. He splintered it with a piece of his own wagon and got me to shelter. I'd have been a frozen corpse otherwise." He looked at her meager setup, the dilapidated shack, the small pile of firewood. His gaze missed nothing. "Looks like his nephew ain't cut from the same cloth." Agnes felt no need to explain or complain. The facts of her situation were plain to see. The law was on his side, she stated, her voice flat. Saul spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "There's law and there's right. They ain't always the same thing. You got somewhere to go for the winter?" "No, you got money for a room." 23 cents, she said, the number now a familiar litany. He was silent for a long time, his sharp eyes scanning the northern horizon, where the clouds were piling up, the color of slate. "There's a storm coming. A bad one. That box won't last a night." He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I owe Thomas a debt." "A man dies, but the debt don't." "Can you walk?" "A good ways." The question was practical, devoid of pity. He was assessing her as he would a pack animal. "I can," Agnes replied, her grip tightening on the ashwood stick. "It's slow going, but I get there good," he said. "Pack your things. What little there is. We leave in an hour." He gave no hint of their destination, no promise of comfort. He was offering a path, nothing more. For the first time in a week, a flicker of something other than grim endurance stirred in Agnes. It was not yet hope, but it was its cousin. The journey was for miles, and it was the hardest for miles of Agnes's life. Saul set a slow, steady pace, never looking back, but she knew he was timing his steps to the rhythmic tap of her walking stick on the hard-packed earth. They moved away from the open plains, climbing into a series of low, broken hills dense with juniper and pine. The terrain was treacherous, a tangle of rock and root. Her ankles ached, and a sharp pain radiated from her hip with every upward step. Rufus stayed close, occasionally whining softly as if sensing her struggle. Saul offered no hand, no word of encouragement. His was a stark and practical form of aid. He would show her the way, but she had to walk it herself. He was testing her, she realized. Testing if she had the grit to deserve the gift he was about to bestow. This is the moment where a life pivots, where the narrative of ruin can be rewritten by a single, stubborn act of will. For the viewer who believes survival is a matter of grand gestures, watch closely. It is almost always a matter of small, excruciating steps. Agnes focused on the ground in front of her, on the next placement of her stick, the next secure footing. She thought of Thomas, of the quiet strength he had possessed, and she drew on that memory as if it were a physical warmth. After what felt like an eternity, Saul stopped. They were in a small, hidden canyon, a narrow cut in the earth walled by sheer rock faces. It was invisible from a distance, a fold in the landscape. "We're here," he said, his voice echoing slightly against the stone. He walked to a place where a rockslide had occurred years ago, a jumble of massive boulders and scree piled against the canyon wall. It looked impassable. But Saul went to a specific spot, braced his hands on a large, flat stone, and pushed. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of rock on rock, the stone pivoted inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. It was not a door, it was a crack in the world. A puff of air, strangely warm and damp, washed over them. It smelled of wet earth and minerals, a scent entirely alien to the crisp, cold air of the canyon. "Your new home," Saul said, his expression unchanged. "Warmer than the governor's mansion and no taxes. Mind your step." He lit a small tallow lamp, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness within the opening, and gestured for her to follow. The entrance was a narrow squeeze, forcing Agnes to turn sideways, her sack scraping against the rough stone. After 10 feet, the passage opened into a space that stunned her into silence. It was not a cave, not in the simple, damp sense she had imagined. It was a chamber, its ceiling arching 20 feet above her head, lost in shadow beyond the lamp's glow. The air was warm, humid, clinging to her skin like a summer morning. But it was the sound that was most remarkable, a soft, constant gurgle of moving water. Saul raised the lamp. In the center of the chamber, a pool of water, perhaps 30 feet across, steamed gently. The light danced off its surface, revealing it to be impossibly clear. At the far end of the pool, water bubbled up from a fissure in the rock floor, the source of the heat and the sound. A slow-moving current carried the water across the basin and into another crack on the opposite side, a silent, subterranean river. "Volcanic," Saul said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Runs deep. Keeps this whole place at a steady temperature. Never freezes. Never changes." He pointed to a wide, flat ledge 10 feet from the water's edge. "That's your living space. Stays dry and warm. The air moves up and out through a chimney fissure high on the ceiling. You can have a small fire for cooking if you need, but the smoke draws, so long as the flame ain't too big." Agnes walked slowly toward the pool, Rufus padding silently beside her. She knelt, ignoring the protest of her knees, and dipped her hand into the water. It was as warm as a bath. For a week, she had been fighting a losing battle against the cold. Here, in the heart of the rock, was a reservoir of impossible warmth. Saul set down a small bundle he'd been carrying. It contained a block of salt, a small sack of flour, a flint and steel, a single battered cooking pot, and a well-honed skinning knife. "This is what I can spare," he said. "The rest is up to you. Rabbits and squirrels in the hills. Water's clean enough to drink. No one knows about this place but me. And now he turned to leave. "I'll be back in the spring. If you ain't here, I'll know the winter took you." He paused at the entrance. "Thomas saved my life. I'm just passing it on. That's how these things work." And then he was gone, the heavy stone grinding shut behind him, plunging the cavern into absolute darkness until Agnes, her hands trembling slightly, struck the flint against the steel and brought a spark, and then a flame, to her new life. December arrived with a vengeance, burying the landscape under 2 feet of snow. The temperature in town hovered near zero for a week straight. Agnes, however, was not cold. Her days in the cavern fell into a quiet, purposeful rhythm. The ambient temperature on her ledge never dropped below 57 degrees. The water in the pool remained a constant, luxurious 104. She had established a routine of trapping, setting snares near the entrance for the small animals that sought shelter in the rocks. Her diet was simple: stewed rabbit, corn cakes cooked on a flat stone, but she ate every day. The constant warmth soothed the ache in her joints, and she found herself moving with an ease she hadn't felt in years. The 23 cents remained tied in her handkerchief, untouched. In mid-December, a break in the weather allowed her to make the trip to town. She needed more salt and, if possible, some beans. Wrapped in her blanket over her dress, with Rufus at her side, she walked the miles through the deep snow, her stick finding purchase in the packed trail. The town looked bleak, its buildings hunched against the cold, a plume of wood smoke rising from every chimney. As she approached the general store, the door opened and Martin stepped out. He stopped dead, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. He had clearly presumed her dead, another nameless victim of the season. "Agnes," he said, his voice tight with surprise. He took in her appearance. She was not gaunt or frostbitten. Her cheeks had color. Her eyes were clear. She did not look like a woman on the brink of starvation. He had imagined her frozen in a ditch or begging for scraps. This quiet, resolute figure did not fit his narrative. "I'm surprised to see you," he said, a note of accusation in his tone. "Where have you been staying?" Agnes met his gaze and, for the first time, felt the dry spark of irony. She offered him a small, placid smile that did not reach her eyes. "I have a place," she said, her voice calm. Warm enough for Martin's eyes narrowed. He could not comprehend it. In his world, warmth was a commodity, purchased by the cord and burned in a stove. He could not imagine a warmth that was simply there. He saw her smile not as a sign of security, but as the vacant expression of a poor, witless creature who had stumbled into some temporary, lucky shelter that was bound to fail. "The worst of the winter is yet to come," he said, a pronouncement that was also a threat. "Don't expect any help from me when your luck runs out." "Why won't?" Agnes said. She nodded politely, then stepped around him and entered the store, leaving him standing on the boardwalk, staring after her, a man utterly baffled by a reality he could not purchase or control. January brought the deep cold. For 20 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above zero. Blizzard swept across the plains, piling snow into drifts 10 feet high. The town was an island in a sea of white. People stayed indoors, their lives circumscribed by the reach of their wood stoves. From a passing trapper who occasionally used the hidden canyon for shelter from the wind, Agnes heard news. The store was running low on flour. 2 families on the south side of town had been struck with lung fever. The price of firewood had doubled. The trapper told her that Martin had bought 10 cords of wood at the start of the winter, a prodigious amount, and was known to keep the fires in the main house roaring day and night, a flagrant display of his wealth and comfort. The man spoke of it with a kind of grudging admiration, but Agnes heard only the sound of wastefulness. In her cavern, life continued its placid, unchanging course. The battle against the cold, the central drama of winter for everyone else, simply did not exist for her. She was outside of it, a spectator to the season's fury. She spent her days mending her clothes, exploring the deeper passages of the cave system with a torch made of pine resin, and keeping her small living area meticulously clean. She would sit by the edge of the steaming pool, soaking her feet, while Rufus slept nearby. The constant, moist warmth was a balm. The ache in her hip had subsided to a dull throb, and some mornings it was gone entirely. She learned the cavern secrets, the way the steam would catch the light from her small fire, the different mineral tastes of the water depending on where she drank from the pool, the family of bats that clung to the highest part of the ceiling, their sleep undisturbed by her quiet presence. She never burned a log for heat. The small fires she made were exclusively for cooking, fueled by dry branches she gathered from the wind-swept ridges above the canyon. A single armload of wood could last her a week. While Martin was burning through his fortune to keep the cold at bay in a large, drafty farmhouse, Agnes was living in a state of perfect, geothermal equilibrium. Her survival was not a struggle. It was an accommodation with the earth, a secret partnership. The dramatic irony was a quiet, constant companion. The man who had everything was fighting a desperate, expensive war against the winter, while the woman he had left with nothing was living in perfect warmth and safety, her comfort provided free of charge. The first signs of the thaw came in late March. The relentless wind softened, and the iron grip of the frost began to loosen. Water dripped from the icicles that hung from the canyon walls. One afternoon, the great stone at the entrance groaned open. It was Saul. He looked thinner than she remembered, and his movements were slower, more deliberate. The winter had taken its toll on him, too. He carried nothing but his rifle. His sharp blue eyes took in the scene on the ledge, the neat pile of firewood, the tidy sleeping area, the pot simmering over a tiny, efficient fire. He looked at Agnes, at her clear skin and the calm in her eyes. He looked at Rufus, whose coat was thick and healthy. A slow, rare smile touched his lips, cracking the weathered surface of his face. "I see the winter didn't take you," he said. "It was a kind winter," Agnes replied, understanding the double meaning of her words. She offered him a bowl of rabbit stew, and he accepted it, sitting on the stone ledge with the weariness of a man who had completed a long and difficult task. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the soft bubbling of the spring and the crackle of the fire. He told her more news from the outside world. The winter had been one of the hardest in a decade. Several homesteads had failed, their owners giving up and heading west. He spoke of Martin's troubles without malice, stating them as simple facts. The nephew had been profligate with his resources, assuming the season would bend to his will. It had not. He burned through his wood by February, Saul said, wiping his bowl clean with a piece of corn cake. Tried to buy more, but the roads were impassable. The house got cold. Real cold. After he finished eating, he reached into a pouch at his belt and took out a small disc-in bag. He handed it to her. Inside were seeds. Corn, beans, and squash. "For the spring," he said. "There's a patch of sun at the mouth of the canyon that gets good light. The soil is rich there." Agnes looked at the seeds, small, hard promises of a future she had not dared to imagine. "You've done more than enough, Saul." He shook his head, rising slowly to his feet. "The debt is paid. Thomas was a good man. He earned a good deed in return. I'm just passing it on." He walked to the entrance, his shoulders slightly stooped. He did not say he wouldn't be back. He didn't have to. They both knew this was the last time they would see each other. He had delivered his gift, seen that it had been properly received, and now his part in the cycle was complete. April melted the last of the great snow drifts, and the high plains turned from a uniform white to a mottled tapestry of brown and green. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the first hardy wildflowers began to push through the damp earth. Agnes emerged from the canyon into this new world not as a survivor, but as someone reborn. The winter spent in the warm, humid air of the cavern had done more than just keep her alive, it had healed her. The persistent cough that had plagued her for years was gone. The arthritis that had made every morning a misery of stiffness and pain had loosened its grip. She still used her walking stick, but more for balance than for support. She walked into town on a bright, clear morning, Rufus trotting happily at her side. The townspeople who saw her stopped and stared. They remembered the frail, dispossessed woman from October. This was not her. This woman stood straighter. There was a vitality in her, an air of quiet self-possession that was utterly confounding. She went to the general store, her list in her pocket. The owner, a portly man named Henderson, watched her approach with wide eyes. "Agnes. By God, we all thought, we figured you were gone." "I'm still here," she said simply. As Henderson measured out her flour and beans, he became her unwitting messenger, eager to share the winter's gossip. "It's been a terrible season. Just terrible. Took old Mrs. Gable and one of the Schmidt boys. And your nephew, Martin, well, he's had a rough go of it." Henderson leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. "He ran out of firewood. Can you imagine? All that money, and he couldn't keep his own house warm. The whole back end of the place is ruined with burst pipes and water damage. And he caught a terrible sickness of the lungs from the damp. Doctor says it's settled in deep. He's had to sell off half of Thomas's prime cattle just to pay the doctor's bills and order wood for next year. Says he's thinking of selling the whole farm. Too much trouble, he calls it." Throughout the recitation, Agnes's expression did not change. She felt no surge of triumph, no satisfaction in his misfortune. Martin's fate was a matter of supreme indifference to her. His ruin was of his own making, a product of the same arrogance and lack of foresight that had led him to cast her out. Her vindication was not in his failure, but in her own quiet success. She paid for her goods, nodded to Henderson, and walked out into the spring sunshine. Her presence in the town, healthy and serene, was a statement more powerful than any accusation she could ever have made. She had not only survived his cruelty, she had, in her own quiet way, prospered because of it. The patch of earth at the mouth of the canyon was just as Saul had described it. Sheltered from the wind and facing south, it soaked up the sun for most of the day. The soil was dark and loamy, enriched by centuries of decomposed pine needles and minerals washed down from the rocks. Agnes spent the days of May preparing her garden. She used a sharpened stick to break the soil, her movements unhurried and efficient. She planted the seed Saul had given her, the corn, the beans, the squash, the three sisters, an ancient and self-supporting combination. She carried water from the creek in her cooking pot, her back and legs strong enough for the task. She was not just planting for sustenance, she was planting roots. She was transforming a temporary shelter into a permanent home. One day in late May, the trapper passed by again. He stopped, accepted a cup of cool water, and told her that Saul had been found dead in his cabin a month earlier. He had passed in his sleep, the trapper said, looking peaceful. An old man whose time had come. Agnes listened, her heart filled with a quiet, respectful grief. The debt was paid. The cycle was complete. A life given for a life saved, a kindness passed down through a generation. Summer settled over the high plains. The sun was warm, the days long. Agnes's garden thrived. The corn grew tall, the beans wrapped themselves around the stalks, and the broad leaves of the squash plants shaded the ground, keeping it moist. She would spend her afternoon sitting on a smooth, sun-warmed rock near the canyon entrance, her mending in her lap, with Rufus dozing at her feet. Behind her was the constant, gentle exhalation of warm, damp air from the cave, her unfailing furnace, her secret source of life. Ahead of her was the garden, her pact with the future. She had been left with nothing, but she had found everything. Martin had taken a house, but she had inherited the earth itself. The ultimate vindication was not that her antagonist had suffered, but that she had flourished. His story was one of waste and decline. Hers was one of resilience and quiet growth. It is a simple truth of the frontier, and perhaps of life itself, that arrogance builds its own prison of cold stone and extravagance, while wisdom finds its warmth in the hidden, enduring gifts of the world. What, after all, is a home? Is it the walls that man builds, or the shelter that nature provides?